What if everything you knew about your family was a lie? A billionaire heir, stranded on a sun-scorched highway, meets a grease-covered mechanic who fixes more than just his engine. But when he sees the sapphire ring on her finger, his entire world shatters. Who is she? Why does she have the ring he gave away as a child? This isn't just a story about a broken car. It's about a buried past, a stolen legacy, and the woman they tried to erase, but who came back to burn an empire to the ground. Lucas Grayson never expected a flat tire to unravel his life's biggest secret, until he saw the ring on her finger. Stay with us, because what starts as a roadside encounter will unravel into a decades-old secret, a lost love, and a family torn apart by power. You won't believe how one ring brings down an entire dynasty. The Arizona desert showed no mercy that day. At high noon, the highway shimmered like molten glass, heat waves dancing above the sun-scorched asphalt. There wasn't a breeze in sight, not even the rustle of a lizard scurrying across the sand. And in the middle of that relentless stretch of Highway 89, a silver Aston Martin Vantage sat motionless, hood steaming like a broken kettle. Inside the car, Lucas Grayson muttered a curse, slamming his palm against the steering wheel. The impact echoed through the luxurious interior like a gunshot. Lucas wasn't used to inconvenience. He was used to control. At 37, Lucas was the CEO of Grayson International, a multi-billion-dollar real estate and technology empire inherited from his father, Victor Grayson, a man as brilliant as he was brutal. Lucas's life was precisely scheduled, neatly pressed, and tightly wound. But this moment, this heat, this delay. He glanced at his platinum wristwatch, 12:03 p.m. He had exactly 27 minutes to join a video call that could secure a $1.2 billion expansion contract with a Singaporean investment firm. Every second lost in the desert heat was a crack in his perfect image. Lucas yanked off his silk tie and unbuttoned his collar. Stepping outside, the sun hit him like a hammer. The dry air burned his throat. He opened the hood and staggered back as a cloud of smoke shot up like a fire signal. Steam poured from the engine compartment. This wasn't just a hiccup. This was failure unforgivable in the Grayson family. Just then, in the distance, a faint rattling sound approached an old, coughing engine that sounded like it belonged to another century. It was a faded green Ford F-150 pickup, rust flaking off the doors, its tailpipe held up by a wire. The truck sputtered to a stop beside Lucas's sleek car. The door creaked open, and out stepped a woman, black, mid-30s, with her hair tied back in a bun and sleeves rolled up to her elbows. Grease-stained jeans, scuffed work boots. Her shirt was checkered red and black, her gloves still on. She looked like the desert had shaped her out of grit and willpower. Danielle Price. Lucas didn't know her name yet, but that woman would become the sharpest memory he'd ever hold. "You all right?" she asked, her voice flat but firm, eyes scanning the car like a mechanic diagnosing an old friend. Lucas stared, blinking. He wasn't used to being approached first, let alone in a tone that lacked any sign of reverence. He stepped back instinctively, like her presence was out of place in the polished world he ruled. "My car's fine," he muttered, though the steam behind him made a lie of it. "Doesn't look fine," she said, not moving. "Pop the hood." Lucas began, but she didn't wait. Danielle strode forward, lifted the hood again, leaned in. Her hands moved with the precision of a surgeon. "Cooling system's busted," she said within 30 seconds. "You've got maybe 5 minutes if you try restarting before it eats itself." Lucas was speechless. He stared at this stranger, this woman who didn't flinch at his $1,000 shoes or the Aston Martin or the fact that he was Lucas Grayson. She didn't ask for his name. She didn't offer hers. Danielle turned, walked back to her truck, pulled out an old red toolbox, and returned to the Aston. She wiped her hands on a rag, revealing fingers worn and blackened by years of grease and steel. Lucas didn't stop her. He just stood there, watching her work with a blend of awe and discomfort. He had grown up in boardrooms, not garages. Raised on privilege, not problems. His father had taught him one rule: the strong lead, the weak serve. Danielle was not following that rule. She was leading. Unbothered. Unapologetic. When she finished rerouting the coolant line, she stepped back. That'll keep it alive for 2 hours. You need a full replacement before long. Lucas fumbled in his wallet, pulling out several $100 bills. Here. As Danielle reached for the money, something caught Lucas's eye. A flicker of light. A ring. Simple silver band. A sapphire stone in the center, scratched but unmistakable. The sunlight hit it just right, and suddenly Lucas wasn't standing on a desert highway anymore. He was 10 years old again. Under a crooked oak tree in the backyard of Bright Path Children's Home, Lucas Grayson, then just Lucas, the quiet kid, had slipped that very ring into the hand of a girl whose name he never forgot. "I'll come back," he had whispered. "I promise." But he never did. His throat tightened. His breath faltered. He stared at the ring like it had come back to accuse him. Danielle noticed. Her hand froze mid-air. "That ring," Lucas whispered. Where did you get it?" Danielle pulled her hand back slightly, closing her fingers around the ring. Her expression didn't change. "It was my mother's." Her voice was cool, but behind it was something layered: caution, maybe, or the instinct to protect something fragile. Lucas swallowed. "It looks familiar." Danielle didn't respond. She took the money, folded it, and turned back toward her truck. "If the engine overheats again, head into Sedona. My shop's behind the old neon sign that says Desert Fix. You'll see it." Lucas wanted to speak. He wanted to shout, "Danielle," or maybe, "I remember you," but no sound came. He stood frozen as her truck rattled away, leaving behind a ghost trail of dust and memories. He leaned against the hood of the Aston Martin, heart pounding. The girl under the oak tree. The promise he broke. The orphanage his father had cut funding to, for tax reasons. And the ring, how had she kept it all these years? That night, Danielle sat alone at her shop. The sun had long dipped below the horizon. Her daughter, Kayla, was asleep in the back room, curled under a blanket worn thin by time. Danielle held the ring in her hand, the sapphire glowing softly under the dim lamp. "He didn't remember," she whispered. "Just the ring." She opened an old drawer. Inside lay documents collected over years: land titles, court notices, a death certificate that was never real. There was also a letter, creased from being read too many times. "My daughter, I didn't abandon you. They made me disappear." Eliza. Her mother. The woman the system erased. The woman the Grayson name buried. Danielle didn't cry. She hadn't in years. But her fingers curled tight around the ring. The past had returned. And this time, she wouldn't let it leave unchallenged. Lucas sat in his car long after Danielle drove away. The engine, now barely humming thanks to her quick fix, was the only sound in the silence of the desert. His hand rested on the steering wheel, but his eyes stared into nothingness straight ahead, but lost somewhere 20 years behind. He could still see the crooked tree. The rusted swings behind the children's home. The way the other kids used to tease him for being the rich boy, dropped off by a fancy car. That was before he became Lucas Grayson, before his name became a brand, before his life was rewritten by someone else's design. Back then, there was only one person who didn't treat him like an outsider. Her name was Danielle. She wasn't loud or flashy, but she listened. Under that same oak tree, he'd once carved their initials into the bark, L+D. No one saw him slip the ring into her palm. He'd stolen it from his mother's jewelry box the day before. It was the last thing she ever wore before her funeral. "I'll come back," he had told Danielle, trying to sound like a hero in one of the books they used to read together. "I swear." But then he didn't. 1 week later, his father pulled him from bright path. No goodbyes. No explanation. Just a cold order from Victor Grayson: this place will rot your ambition. Lucas hadn't known then what that really meant. He was 10. He didn't realize that his father was also cutting the orphanage's funding, directly closing the only place that had felt like home. All he understood was that the girl under the tree was gone. And now, 2 decades later, she had stood in front of him with motor oil on her hands and fire in her eyes. He pressed the start button, and the car jerked forward. The GPS directed him toward Sedona, but he wasn't listening. His mind drifted toward a single question that haunted him: what if she remembers? Back at the small garage just outside Sedona, Danielle stood in front of the workbench in silence. The tools were all in place. The sockets, wrenches, screwdrivers lined up with military precision, just like her Uncle Luther had taught her. The man who took her in after Bright Path closed. The only one who never asked her to be anything but strong. She reached under the bench and pulled out a worn photo album. Inside were only a few pictures. One of her as a child in front of the orphanage. Another of her and Luther, arms crossed in front of the shop when she was 16. And one more faded, blurry, but unmistakable. A young white boy with sun-bleached hair. Grinning, holding a wooden bird carving she had helped him finish. Lucas. He had once carved her name into a plank behind the garden shed. He never thought she'd find it, but she did. She found every promise he'd left behind. She closed the album and slid it back under the workbench. It wasn't the memory of him that hurt. It was the memory of believing someone would come back. Waiting. Hoping. She had waited long after Bright Path shut down. After the kids were scattered to different homes, like furniture sold at auction. Danielle had been sent to a foster house where she was treated like a maid, cleaning, cooking, scrubbing floors in silence. At 14, she ran away. Hid in Luther's shed behind his mechanic shop. He didn't turn her in. He just opened the door, handed her a sandwich, and said, "You'll need stronger hands if you want to hold a wrench." That was the first time in years anyone had believed she could be more than forgotten. She spent the next decade building a life of quiet resistance. Fixing engines, changing tires, patching up broken transmissions, and never letting herself rely on anyone else again. Until Kayla was born. Danielle smiled faintly as she looked toward the back room, where her daughter lay curled beneath a blanket. 13 years old. Curious, kind, always asking questions about engines and the stars. A child who never asked about her father because Danielle never gave her a reason to. Not out of shame. But because the answer was more complicated than he left. Lucas hadn't just left. He had disappeared from her world like a lie told too early. And now he was back wearing a $5,000 watch, driving a supercar, and looking at her like a stranger. Danielle took off her gloves and sat down at the workbench. She opened a drawer and pulled out an old manila folder. Inside were copies of public records, property deeds, letters. Her mother's land confiscated when the state rezoned for urban development. Official reason: no legal heirs. But Danielle had been a minor. Her mother, Eliza Price, had never died in that car crash they claimed. She had proof. A letter written in her mother's shaky handwriting, sent anonymously 8 years ago. Only one line inside: "They made me disappear." No return address. No fingerprints. Just the truth in ink. Danielle had buried it. Told herself it wasn't safe. That no one would believe her. That fighting Grayson International was suicide. But now Lucas had found her. Accident or fate, it didn't matter. The ring had remembered. And the girl under the tree had grown into a woman who no longer waited. That night, in his luxury suite at the Skylight Resort, Lucas sat in front of his laptop, staring at an open Zoom window. His investors were waiting. He didn't care. On the nightstand was his tie, crumpled. On the desk, his untouched bourbon. And in his pocket the ring. No, not the ring. A photo of it. He had snapped a picture of Danielle's hand when she reached for the money. Subconsciously. Instinctively. Now he stared at it like it was an artifact from a forgotten lifetime. He pulled out his phone. Found the archived email folder. Typed "Bright Path" into the search bar. A single result popped up. Subject: Termination, Bright Path Children's Home. Date: July 14, 2005. From Victor Grayson. To Legal Division, Grayson Foundation. Effective immediately, cease all charitable disbursements to Bright Path Children's Home. The institution no longer aligns with our long-term branding strategy. No public disclosure required. Note: Lucas is not to be informed. Lucas stared at the screen. His father's signature in block letters. Cold. Unapologetic. He closed the laptop. This wasn't just about guilt anymore. Danielle wasn't a memory. She was proof. And the past didn't stay buried forever, not even beneath millions. The morning sun filtered through the garage windows, painting golden streaks across the concrete floor of Desert Fix Auto. Dust floated lazily in the air, caught in that warm light, but Danielle Price didn't notice. She stood at the workbench, her hands still, eyes fixed on the open file before her. The words on the paper blurred and sharpened, over and over, as her heartbeat matched the rhythmic throb in her temples. She had spent the better part of the night sorting through those documents, copies of land deeds, zoning records, forged signatures, and one haunting death certificate, Eliza Marie Price, deceased, March 2007. Cause: vehicular trauma. But Danielle knew better. Her mother had never died. 8 years ago, she received a letter in the mail. No return address. No explanation. Just one line, in her mother's unmistakable handwriting: "I didn't abandon you. They made me disappear." She hadn't dared tell anyone. Not even Luther, her uncle. Not even Kayla, her daughter. The truth was too dangerous, too fragile to speak aloud in a world that belonged to men like Victor Grayson. The same man who now owned the land where her childhood home once stood. The same man who had claimed there were no heirs to that land, despite Danielle being alive and underage at the time. And now, his son, the boy who once promised to come back under a crooked oak tree, had shown up on her roadside like a bad memory wrapped in a silk tie and Italian shoes. She clenched her jaw. Her fingers moved to the sapphire ring on her finger. It had dulled with time, the silver worn down, the stone scratched. But the memory it carried was as sharp as ever. He had given it to her as a child. A promise in a stolen moment. "I'll come back." He never did. Not until yesterday. Behind the workbench, a soft creak of a door broke the silence. Kayla stood barefoot in her pajamas, hair tousled, blinking sleepily. "Mom," she said, rubbing her eyes. "You're still working?" Danielle forced a smile and shut the folder. "Just sorting paperwork, baby. Go wash up. I'll fix you something." Kayla nodded and disappeared down the narrow hallway that led to the sleeping area at the back of the shop. Danielle stayed frozen for a moment longer. She knew now what had to be done. She had spent years surviving, building a wall between herself and the past. But that wall had cracked yesterday, and behind it was a fire she no longer intended to put out. 2 hours later, she sat across from her Uncle Luther in his trailer, just outside Sedona. The old man leaned back in his chair, glasses perched on his nose, studying the stack of documents she'd spread across the kitchen table. Outside, the wind rustled dry mesquite trees. Inside, silence hung heavy between them. "You kept all this?" Luther asked at last, his voice gruff. Danielle nodded. 8 years. I was waiting for a reason. He glanced at her. And now? She didn't blink. Now I have one. He looked back at the papers. That boy yesterday, the one with the fancy car. That Lucas? She said nothing, but the fire in her eyes was enough. Luther exhaled. Well, damn. Danielle looked down at an old photo she placed on the table, a faded snapshot of her at age 12, standing in front of the Price family home with a blonde-haired boy at her side. Lucas. They had been children, unaware that the world would soon separate them. She remembered how his smile had made her believe promises could be kept. That there were people who didn't see her as less. I think he didn't know, she said softly. Luther frowned. Doesn't matter. His last name sure as hell does. Danielle ran her hand over the photo. I need to know how deep this goes. And I think he's the only way to find out. Luther leaned back in his chair, eyeing her with a mix of concern and pride. You're serious about this? I want the truth. Not just for me, she said. For Kayla. For my mother. For everyone they buried with fake signatures and empty promises. Luther nodded slowly. Then, without a word, he stood up and disappeared into the back room. When he returned, he carried a wooden box with brass hinges. Danielle recognized it instantly. Inside was a stack of personal mementos from her mother's life. Photos, old letters, the original deed to the Price homestead. And on top of it all a hand-carved wooden bird, the tail chipped, initials carved into its wing, L+D. Her breath caught. You kept this? She whispered. Luther shrugged. You carved it together. I thought maybe one day you'd want to remember. Danielle picked up the bird, tracing the initials with her thumb. She didn't cry. She couldn't afford to. That evening, Lucas Grayson stood at the edge of his father's private study in the Grayson estate. The house was quiet, the marble floors echoing with every step. In his hands was a thick leather file, one he had just pulled from the family archive hidden beneath the library rug. Across the cover, handwritten in sharp ink, Price. Inside, a map of the Sedona property, zoning blueprints, legal transfer forms, and a death certificate he now knew was fake. Victor Grayson's signature adorned nearly every page. But it was the note scribbled in the margin that made Lucas feel like the ground beneath him was shifting. Ensure the girl remains classified as a minor. Expedite land transfer. No heirs equals no contest. VG. His father had orchestrated the entire thing. Cold. Calculated. Surgical. And he, Lucas, had grown up believing their success was earned. He set the file down and stared out the window, where the moon hung over the desert like a silent witness. Then he reached for his phone and typed a message. To Danielle Price. Subject, we need to talk. Now. She didn't reply. But when he pulled into the lot behind her garage 20 minutes later, she was waiting. Leaning against the wall, arms crossed, eyes unreadable. Lucas stepped out of his car, holding the file. I found this, he said simply. She didn't move. Took you long enough. Inside the shop, she spread her own documents across the workbench. Their eyes met. Then they both sat down in silence, the air between them filled with ink and betrayal. Lucas flipped through the records she had compiled, property records, legal notices, even a copy of her mother's forged death certificate. He saw the handwriting match. The zoning violations. The silence paid for with ink and fear. Danielle's voice cut through the stillness. You want to know what I want? Lucas looked up. Yes. I want my mother's name cleared. I want her back, if she's still alive. And I want every single person who helped erase us to be held accountable. He swallowed. That includes my father. It might include you, she added sharply. If you choose to look the other way again. Lucas shook his head. I won't. A beat passed. Then Danielle asked, did you know about the orphanage? He looked down, ashamed. Not until recently. My father pulled me out. I thought it closed from lack of funding. I didn't know he cut it off on purpose. Danielle clenched her jaw. He destroyed the only place that ever felt like home. Scattered the kids like dust. Some of them ended up in homes worse than prison. I ran away at 14. Lived in a garage for months before Luther found me. I'm sorry, Lucas said. I don't need your apology, she replied. I need your help. He nodded slowly. Then help me make this right. They sat in silence again. Not as enemies. Not yet as allies. But as two people who had found each other again at the edge of a fire that had been burning for 20 years. Danielle stood and reached for a sealed envelope. I think my mother is still alive, she said. I just don't know where they took her. Lucas looked up sharply. Why do you think that? She handed him the letter. His eyes scanned the page. A single line, they made me disappear. His hands trembled as he looked up. You think she's being held somewhere? Danielle's voice was steel. I know she is. Lucas closed the file, his eyes steady now. Then let's find her. Danielle nodded. This wasn't about the past anymore. It was about the reckoning that would come next. Lucas Grayson had lived most of his adult life in echo chambers, boardrooms where everyone agreed, galas where everyone smiled, and dinners where no one asked questions that couldn't be answered with a champagne toast. But now, sitting in the passenger seat of Danielle Price's rusted pickup truck, bouncing along a gravel backroad east of Sedona, silence had a different shape. It wasn't empty. It was full of guilt, memory, and the weight of his father's empire collapsing brick by brick in his mind. Danielle said nothing as she drove, her eyes focused, one hand gripping the wheel while the other rested near the gearshift, fingers occasionally brushing the silver ring on her hand. That same ring he had given her when they were just children. It was strange. The stone was small. The metal scuffed. Yet now, it felt heavier than his entire inheritance. They stopped at a fenced-off plot of land outside town. Tall grass swayed in the wind, and weather-beaten remnants of a wooden sign poked up from the dirt. Only the faded letters, Hope, remained. Lucas stepped out first, the dry wind tugging at his sleeves. This was the orphanage, he asked softly. Danielle nodded. New Hope. The state bulldozed it a year after the funding dried up. Said it was unsafe. He stared at the field. I thought it had closed. I didn't know it was destroyed. You were gone before they brought the machines, she said, walking toward the empty lot. The day you disappeared, they told us the Graysons had withdrawn support. Kids cried for weeks. Then we all got scattered. Some placed in homes. Some, never heard from again. Lucas turned toward her. I didn't choose to leave, Danielle. My father made that decision. I was told we were moving. That it wasn't safe for me anymore. She didn't answer, but her eyes said everything. For her, silence had never been safety. It had been abandonment. He knelt, brushing his hand across the cracked ground. A flash of memory, Danielle laughing under the tree behind the orphanage, carving initials into bark. A moment that should have been meaningless, yet he remembered it with frightening clarity. I think I found something, Danielle called suddenly. She was by the remains of the old shed, kneeling near a warped piece of metal half buried in sand. Beneath it, partially sheltered from sun and time, was a broken wooden crate. She pried it open, and inside lay faded documents, old staff rosters, donation receipts, and at the very bottom, an envelope. Lucas stepped closer as she opened it. Inside was a copy of a patient transfer form. Patient, Eliza Marie Price. Condition, unstable cognition. Receiving facility, Haven Creek Psychiatric Center. Authorization signed by Victor J. Grayson. Danielle's breath caught. Haven Creek. A Grayson-funded private facility. Lucas paled. I've never heard of it. Danielle's fingers clenched the paper. Because it wasn't made to be heard of. Later that evening, they sat in the back room of Desert Fix Auto, the air heavy with motor oil and unspoken fears. The small fluorescent light flickered overhead. Danielle had spread the documents out again, adding the transfer form to the pile. Lucas rubbed his eyes. This center. I think I've seen the name before in our tax filings. Buried under a charitable initiative. No public address. Probably off-grid. Danielle paced the room. He faked her death, then had her declared mentally unfit and locked away. If she's still there, it's been nearly 2 decades. Lucas hesitated. There's a problem. Facilities like that, they're designed to erase people. No digital records, no visitors unless approved. We don't need approval, Danielle said, her voice hard. We need proof. And I think you're the one person who can walk through the front door without raising alarms. Lucas looked up. You want me to go inside? You still wear the name. You still carry the keycard. Use it before it's worthless. He leaned back, fingers interlaced behind his head. If my father finds out. He won't. Not if you play the part. For once in your life, Lucas, be the son he raised just long enough to break into his lies. The silence hung, thick and metallic. Then he nodded. The next morning, Lucas stood in the parking lot of a nondescript, white stone building tucked into the hills north of Flagstaff. No sign. No welcome desk. Just a single security booth and a gate that opened as soon as the scanner read his Grayson ID. The receptionist smiled the way people smile when they've been trained to greet devils. Mr. Grayson. We weren't expecting you. He straightened his collar. Last-minute check. I'm doing a facilities audit on all foundation partners. My father wants a full report. The receptionist didn't question it. She handed him a guest badge and waved him through. The hallways were sterile. White. Silent. Nurses passed him without eye contact. Doors lined the walls, most of them unmarked. He made it to the records room without alert. Inside, filing cabinets stretched wall to wall. He scanned names. Most were initials only. Pseudonyms. Case numbers. Finally, one drawer caught his attention, E. Price, patient 0907. He pulled the file. Dozens of pages. Observations. Medical records. But every report was vague. No formal diagnosis. No incident history. And no contact from family listed. He flipped to the last page. Condition, dormant. No risk of exposure. Ongoing sedation advised. Directive, no public identification. Monitor indefinitely. Signed, V.J. Grayson. Lucas closed the file, his hands cold. She was still here. He turned to leave, but before he could reach the exit, he spotted the door at the end of the hall. Room 28. It wasn't locked. He opened it slowly. Inside, a woman sat in a wheelchair by the window, her back to the door. Thin. Gray hair tied in a loose braid. Her hands resting on her lap. A silver ring on her finger, identical to the one Danielle wore. Miss Price? Lucas said gently. The woman didn't respond. He stepped closer. Eliza? She turned. Her eyes piercing blue locked onto his. And for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, she whispered, Lucas. His heart stopped. Back at the shop, Danielle paced. She hadn't heard from him in hours. Every second stretched into a knot in her stomach. Kayla sat on the couch nearby, flipping through a book, watching her mother silently unravel. Finally, the phone buzzed. A text, she's here. She recognized me. I'm coming back now. Danielle sank into the chair, her hands trembling. It was real. It was finally, terrifyingly, real. When Lucas returned that night, he brought with him more than just a file. He brought the truth. "I don't know how she survived that long," he said, setting down the bag. "They kept her sedated for years. Rotating staff. No real care. Just containment." Danielle opened the file. Inside were photographs, current images of her mother, her room, her medication logs. And one note that chilled her to the bone. "Maintain isolation. Patient carries sensitive familial information that could endanger assets." She read it twice. Then she looked at Lucas. "You're going to help me get her out?" It wasn't a question. It was an order. And Lucas, who had once obeyed nothing but stockholders and quarterly reports, nodded without hesitation. Yes. That night, Danielle sat alone on the steps behind the garage. The stars overhead blinked quietly in the desert sky. In her hand, she held the ring again, the sapphire catching moonlight. She whispered, "I'm coming, Mom." For the first time in years, she believed it might be true. The night in Sedona was unnaturally still. Danielle Price stood by the tool rack at Desert Fix Auto, her hands coated in motor grease though she hadn't touched a wrench in hours. Her thoughts raced faster than any engine. She had spent years building a life out of silence, choosing safety over conflict, but now, with the truth finally clawing its way to the surface, she knew hiding was no longer an option. Across the workbench, Lucas Grayson laid out the floor plan of Haven Creek Psychiatric Center. He had printed it from a confidential file hidden deep in the Grayson Foundation's archives. The document wasn't supposed to exist. Most of the building's blueprints had been removed from state databases years ago, buried behind a maze of shell organizations and shadow accounts. Lucas traced a path on the plan with his finger. "She's in room 28. No cameras. No electronic keycards. That section was designed to be inaccessible unless you're on the internal staff list, which I still technically am." Danielle's eyes narrowed. "How many guards?" 4 on shift. 2 rotate through the lower wing every 30 minutes. 1 at the front entrance. 1 by the records room. And the patients? Secluded. Most are under sedation. My guess is they keep them quiet for legal deniability. Danielle folded her arms, scanning the plan. "This isn't a rescue. This is an extraction." Lucas glanced up. "Is that a problem?" She shook her head slowly. "It's what they deserve." Lucas leaned back, exhaling. "We'll need help. I can create a 90-minute blind spot in the building's security logs. After that, any delay and we're on every watch list the Foundation has." "Luther's in," Danielle said without hesitation. "And I know someone else." The next morning, Danielle and Lucas met with Serena Wallace, an old friend of Danielle's from her days working as a mechanic in Phoenix. Serena was ex-military, discharged after exposing corruption within her own command unit. Since then, she had lived mostly off-grid, picking up contract security work when it suited her. Danielle laid the file in front of her. "We need to get into Haven Creek. Quiet. Fast. And we need to get someone out." Serena read the file silently, her lips pressed into a flat line. When she finally looked up, her eyes were hard. "You're asking me to help you break into a facility owned by the most powerful family in the Southwest?" Danielle nodded. "Yes." Serena closed the file. "Okay. I'm in." Lucas blinked in surprise. "Just like that?" Serena shrugged. "Grayson Money shut down a housing project I helped build for veterans in Yuma. Been waiting for an excuse." That night, they rehearsed the plan again and again. Lucas would use his credentials to access the employee gate. Serena would disable the alarm system through the emergency maintenance port. Danielle and Luther would enter through the south delivery tunnel during the blind spot Lucas created. Once inside, They'd retrieve Eliza Price and exit through the rear access road where Serena's van would be waiting, with doctored license plates and a decoy GPS tracker. It was reckless. Dangerous. But it was the only shot they had. As midnight approached, Danielle stood outside the garage watching Kayla sleep through the open window. She had left a letter under her daughter's pillow just in case. In it, she had written nothing about the facility, or the Graysons, or the empire they were about to unravel. She only wrote one thing: if I don't come back, remember this, your voice matters. No one gets to silence you. Then she turned away and got into the van. At 3:27 a.m., the van rolled to a stop behind the tree line bordering Haven Creek. The facility's pale concrete walls loomed in the moonlight like a bunker. Serena checked her watch. Security logs reroute in 3 minutes, she said. Lucas looked at Danielle, who had already slipped on her gloves. You sure about this? Danielle didn't blink. This isn't for me. It's for her. Lucas turned to the panel near the service entrance. He pulled a small device from his bag, wired it into the circuit board, and waited. The red light on the panel blinked once, then turned green. Serena gave a sharp nod. Go. They moved like shadows. Danielle and Luther entered through the supply tunnel, creeping past stacks of oxygen tanks and folded linens. Lucas led them through the east corridor, where even the fluorescent lights seemed to buzz more softly. No alarms. No resistance. When they reached the patient ward, Lucas signaled to a quiet door on the left. Room 28. Danielle stepped in first. Eliza Price sat in her chair by the window, the same position she had been in when Lucas first saw her. Her body was thinner, but her eyes were alert now, filled with something more than sedation. Recognition. Danielle froze. Mom. Eliza turned. Danielle, she whispered. You came. Tears welled in Danielle's eyes but didn't fall. She rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside the chair. Her hands clutched her mother's like she might vanish if she let go. I'm taking you home, she said. But the moment was short-lived. From the hallway came a voice. Unit 3, report your position. Code Violet in South Wing. Repeat Code Violet. Lucas paled. They've noticed the data void. Serena's voice crackled through the earpiece. You've got 12 minutes before they isolate the building. Danielle helped her mother stand. Eliza's legs trembled, but she held firm. Let's go, Luther said, positioning himself behind them. The hallway echoed with footsteps. They turned a corner and ran straight into a guard. Danielle moved first. She threw a punch so clean and fast the guard didn't have time to shout. He crumpled. Serena's voice came again. New plan. They've blocked the exit road. I'm rerouting to the east perimeter. 30 yards from the maintenance gate. Lucas adjusted his grip on Eliza's arm. There's a side corridor through the infirmary. Let's move. The next 5 minutes were chaos. Alarms began to blare, a shrill sound designed to destabilize. Red lights flashed across the corridors. Doors slammed shut. Voices shouted over radios. Danielle led the way, muscles burning, lungs tight. Lucas held Eliza steady. Luther blocked every corner like he'd never stopped being a soldier. They reached the east wall and saw the van waiting beyond the fence. But 2 security guards blocked the gate. Serena emerged from the driver's side and walked toward them like she owned the place. She was dressed in a black tactical vest, ID badge clipped to her belt. Facility inspection, she snapped. Authorized by Victor Grayson himself. Move. The guards hesitated. We weren't informed. You are now, Serena barked, flashing a fake clearance document. Open the gate or explain to the board why the chairman's son was late for his inspection. It worked. The guards stepped aside. Danielle helped her mother into the van, Lucas followed, and Luther slammed the back doors shut. Serena floored the gas, and the tires screamed against the asphalt. Behind them, the Haven Creek alarms kept wailing, but none of them looked back. At sunrise, they reached a safe house 2 hours outside Phoenix, an old barn converted into a temporary shelter. Inside, Eliza Price slept in a cot under a wool blanket. Her breathing was steady. Her fingers still clutched Danielle's hand, even in sleep. Luther stepped outside to smoke. Lucas sat across the room, his head in his hands. Danielle finally broke the silence. "You didn't have to do this." Lucas looked up. "I did." She studied him. "Why now?" He took a breath. "Because I finally realized I wasn't just raised in the dark, helped keep the lights off." Danielle stood. "There's still more." Lucas nodded. "And I'm not going anywhere." The next day, Lucas returned to the Grayson estate. He walked through the front door, past the staff, up the marble staircase, and into his father's study without knocking. Victor Grayson stood at the bar, pouring whiskey. "So," he said. "You're back." Lucas held out a flash drive. "What's this?" Victor asked. "Proof," Lucas replied. "Of what you did to Eliza Price." Victor didn't blink. "I protected our interests." "You buried a woman alive." "I preserved the family." "You're welcome." Lucas's voice dropped. "She's safe now. And so are the files. If anything happens to her or to Danielle, they'll go public." Victor's smile faded. Lucas turned to leave. "You'll destroy everything," Victor called after him. Lucas stopped at the door. "No," he said quietly. "You already did." 3 days after Eliza Price was freed from Haven Creek, the air around Desert Fix Auto thickened with a tension that no summer breeze could wash away. The sun hovered high above Sedona, merciless and unrelenting, but it was nothing compared to what burned inside Danielle. She sat alone on the porch beside her mother, watching Eliza doze peacefully in a wicker chair borrowed from Luther's backyard. The lines on Eliza's face had softened since her escape. The shadows in her eyes had faded slightly, like fog rolling back from a hidden landscape. But Danielle could feel the fragility beneath the surface. 20 years in confinement couldn't be undone with a single rescue. Healing would take time. Maybe a lifetime. And time was not a luxury they had. Inside the house, Lucas sat hunched over Danielle's kitchen table, combing through piles of scanned documents, legal records, forged transfer agreements, shell company charts, all evidence he had collected over the past week with Serena's help. Each sheet was a blade, each paragraph a bruise. The truth was no longer whispered in shadows, it was laid bare in ink and time-stamped emails. Victor Grayson hadn't just hidden Eliza away, he had orchestrated a vast operation built on erasing people who stood in the way. And now, the world was about to find out. Lucas picked up a black USB drive and stared at it. This wasn't just data. This was a matchstick aimed at the foundations of his father's empire. One press of a keyboard, one forwarded link to the right journalist, and Grayson Holdings would never be the same. But he hesitated. Danielle stepped inside quietly, watching him. She could tell something inside him had changed. Not just guilt. Not just awakening. Something deeper. A son finally seeing the man his father truly was. "I can do it," she said gently. Lucas didn't look up. "No. It has to be me." Danielle pulled out a chair. "Then why are you waiting?" He finally met her eyes. "Because when I send this, I can't undo it. I can't go back to being Lucas Grayson. Not the face on the billboards. Not the heir to boardrooms and charity galas. I'll be a traitor to a legacy I spent my entire life upholding." "You'll be a man who finally told the truth," she said softly. Lucas held her gaze. Then he plugged the USB into his laptop and typed a single sentence, "To the editors of the Beacon, this is not just a whistleblower's report. It's an obituary for a dynasty built on silence. He hit send. And the world began to shift. The first tremors hit within 12 hours. The Beacon, a national investigative outlet known for toppling politicians and tech CEOs alike, published a 6,000-word exposé titled, Buried Alive, The Price of Power at Grayson Holdings. It detailed the illegal confinement of Eliza Price, the forged documents surrounding the seizure of Monroe land, the internal memos referencing containment protocols, and the false death certificate signed by Victor Grayson himself. It included photographs, scan after scan, and concluded with a single sentence that struck harder than any headline: she lived, but they tried to make her disappear. By the next morning, every major outlet had picked up the story. CNN, the New York Times, even global agencies. News anchors spoke her name like it had just returned from the grave. Eliza Price. Survivor. Mother. Witness. Victor Grayson remained silent. But silence could no longer protect him. Back in Sedona, Eliza stood before a full-length mirror for the first time in decades. Her reflection surprised her. She wasn't the girl who had been taken. Nor the ghost they tried to erase. She was something new now. A woman whose scars no longer needed to be hidden. She stepped outside into the full light of morning, wearing a clean white blouse Danielle had pressed for her. Her hands still trembled slightly, but her voice no longer wavered. "I want to speak," she told Danielle. "If they ask for interviews. If there's a chance I can say what happened, want to say it." Danielle's throat tightened. "Are you sure?" "I've been silent for 20 years, Eliza replied. "I'm ready to be heard." The first public statement came at a community center just outside Phoenix, hosted by an independent human rights council. Eliza stood at the podium, supported by Danielle on one side and Luther on the other. Her voice, though soft, carried the weight of every year she'd been missing. "They told me my daughter would forget me. That the world would forget me. That I didn't matter because I didn't have a last name carved into buildings or engraved on brass plates. But I never forgot. And I never stopped believing that one day, the truth would rise." The crowd erupted in applause. And somewhere in the shadows, the Graysons watched their name begin to rot from the roots. Victor Grayson appeared 2 days later at a private press conference in New York. His hair was grayer, his posture tenser, but his arrogance still intact. He denied the accusations, called the documents falsified, and referred to Eliza Price as a woman whose mental instability was weaponized by others. Lucas watched the live feed on Danielle's couch. His hands were still. His jaw clenched. When Victor mentioned him, "My son has been manipulated by those who seek to destroy our family," Lucas didn't flinch. He simply stood, walked to the window, and stared out at the quiet Arizona dusk. Danielle joined him. "He's scared," she said. "He should be," Lucas replied. That night, they received a call from Elise Worthington, a former Grayson executive who had resigned quietly 3 years earlier. She now lived in Santa Fe and had her own reasons for hating the Grayson name. Elise offered something Lucas had been searching for since day one: a second set of files. Deeper. Older. Hidden in a secure vault in one of the original Grayson Holdings offices. "Come yourself," Elise warned. "Don't send anyone. And don't tell your father. These records were never supposed to exist." Lucas left at dawn. While he was gone, Danielle continued building the next step, what they called the reclamation. A legal motion prepared by an independent firm to request full restitution of the Monroe land seized under fraudulent terms. Brandon had helped arrange it anonymously, using funds quietly transferred from Grayson's and used charitable trust account. Danielle didn't want revenge. She wanted restoration. A formal return of the land. A public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. And an end to the name that had haunted her since the orphanage fell. But there was one piece missing. Kayla. For days, Danielle had kept her daughter away from the chaos, safe with Luther's old friend on the outskirts of town. But that morning, as she picked her up, Kayla said something that made her heart stop. "Mom, they said on the news that Grandpa tried to make you disappear." Danielle pulled over on the side of the road, turned to her daughter, and held her hand tightly. "Listen to me," she said. "No matter what anyone says, no one can make you disappear. Not if you know who you are." Kayla nodded slowly. "I know who you are." Danielle kissed her forehead. "That's all that matters." When Lucas returned that evening, his hands were shaking. He placed the second set of documents on the table. Danielle opened them slowly. Inside were files going back 30 years, blueprints of early land deals, internal memos about tax evasions, recorded conversations between Victor Grayson and senior officials arranging off-the-books hospital admissions. And at the center of it all, one note. Subject E, price must be neutralized before media acquisition completes. Leverage mental health classification to ensure full control. Signed, again, Victor J. Grayson. It was over. Not just the charade. The entire legacy. Danielle looked at Lucas, and for the first time, she saw a man completely detached from the world he once inherited. Not ashamed. Not afraid. Just ready. "What now?" she asked. "We give this to the Attorney General," Lucas said. "We go on record. We file the land suit. And we hold a press conference. A public one. Live." The next morning, as news vans began to park along the red cliffs of Sedona, and drones flew overhead capturing footage of Desert Fix Auto, Danielle prepared the speech she never thought she'd give. Eliza would stand with her. Lucas would take the podium. And behind them, Kayla would watch, not as a child in the shadow of secrets, but as the future they were trying to protect. Lucas looked at Danielle one last time before stepping up to the microphone. "You ready?" he asked. She smiled, faint but strong. "We were born ready." The cameras blinked. And the truth finally spoke. The cameras clicked like a swarm of insects. Every angle, every lens, every outlet had its eyes fixed on the dusty red porch of Desert Fix Auto, now transformed into a makeshift stage for the reckoning of an empire. The Grayson name, once untouchable, now quivered under the weight of everything it had buried. Lucas stood center stage, a man no longer sheltered by his lineage but defined by his break from it. He wore no suit. Just a gray button-down and rolled sleeves. His voice, steady but raw, echoed through the open mic. "My name is Lucas Grayson. I was raised in a house built on secrets. For years, I believed my success was earned until I discovered that behind every achievement, every accolade, every deal, was a lie. And behind that lie, a woman was buried alive. That woman is Eliza Price, my mother's best friend, my mentor's sister, and a survivor of my father's crimes." Gasps rippled through the crowd. He continued, holding up a thin stack of documents. "These files contain the evidence. Forged death certificates. Medical reports. Financial records linking Victor Grayson to illegal land transfers and covert institutionalization programs. He didn't just try to disappear Eliza, he tried to erase her entire bloodline." He paused, turned slightly, and gestured to the woman standing behind him. Eliza Price stepped forward. She needed no paper. No script. Her words were simple, but each one carved into the air like stone. "I lived in silence for 20 years. Locked away under the justification of mental instability. But I remember everything. I remember the day they took me. I remember the promise I made to my daughter that I would return. And now, I'm here. Not to seek revenge but to restore what was stolen. Our names. Our truth. Our land." Then Danielle took the microphone. "My name is Danielle Price. I am the daughter of Eliza. And I am not afraid of your boardrooms, your press statements, or your attorneys. My mother's name will be cleared. Our land will be reclaimed. And the story you tried to erase will now be written in every newspaper, broadcast on every station, and remembered by every person who believes they're too small to matter. She reached into her jacket and held up the sapphire ring. Its silver band caught the light like a sliver of truth finally seeing daylight. "This ring was once a promise," she said. "You broke it. But we didn't forget." That moment was the spark. And the storm began. Within 24 hours, the Sedona press conference had gone viral. Live streams on every major network. Headlines blaring across the country. Hashtags flooded the internet, hashtag price of silence, hashtag Grayson collapse, hashtag we remember Eliza. Victor Grayson issued a cold, pre-written statement through his attorneys denying all accusations and threatening defamation suits. But the tides had already turned. Independent fact-checkers confirmed the authenticity of every document. Former employees of Haven Creek came forward, anonymously at first, then publicly, with chilling testimonials. The Attorney General's office launched a formal investigation. 3 senators called for a federal ethics probe into Grayson Holdings' lobbying practices. And the Grayson board, previously loyal, bound by years of favors and stock, held an emergency vote to suspend Victor as CEO pending the outcome of the investigation. He didn't appear in public again. But the silence no longer protected him. Meanwhile, Danielle's land reclamation case reached court. The legal team had prepared everything: the fraudulent title transfer, the zoning violations, the doctored signatures, and most critically, the death certificate that had claimed Eliza's life without her consent. The courtroom was packed on the first day. Journalists lined the walls. Activists filled the seats. And Eliza sat quietly beside Danielle, her presence a living contradiction to the lies written in black and white. Their lawyer made the opening statement simple. "This is not a case about property. It's about erasure. About the systemic belief that some lives are easier to ignore than others. But you can't erase a living woman. And you cannot bury the truth forever." Across the aisle, the Grayson legal team was visibly shaken. They had come prepared for a public relations battle, not for a mother standing from the grave or a son who had chosen the truth over inheritance. The judge agreed to fast-track the hearing. 3 days in, the verdict was unanimous. The land was to be returned to the Price family. All contracts voided. The Grayson development permits revoked. The area formerly designated as Aurora Heights would be restored under its original name, the Eliza Reserve. Tears fell freely down Danielle's cheeks as the gavel struck. But there was no victory parade. Just breath. Just silence. Just the weight of history finally shifting. 2 weeks later, the FBI raided multiple Grayson Holdings properties in Phoenix, Denver, and New York. They seized hard drives, ledgers, and internal memos. Victor Grayson was formally charged with conspiracy to commit fraud, unlawful imprisonment, forgery, and obstruction of justice. When the arrest warrant was executed, he was found alone in his mountain estate, sipping whiskey in the dark, surrounded by paintings of himself. The cameras captured everything. His once polished appearance now sunken, eyes hollow, lips trembling. When asked by a reporter if he had anything to say, he replied, "You can't destroy a name." But that was no longer true. Because the name had already destroyed itself. Back in Sedona, life did not return to normal. It evolved. The Monroe land, once cleared for skyscrapers, became home to something else, a vocational training center for women, single parents, and youth from underserved communities. The campus was named Eliza House, and it included a garden planted by Danielle and Kayla, lemon trees, tomatoes, and sunflowers. The same seeds Danielle's mother once planted before being taken away. Lucas, now publicly disowned by his father, adopted his mother's surname, Lucas Monroe. He dissolved all remaining Grayson shares he legally controlled and transferred the money into a nonprofit for justice reform. He and Danielle worked side by side now, not as saviors, but as witnesses who refused to stay silent. Kayla helped paint the community murals on the outer walls of Eliza House. Bright colors, winding vines, a large oak tree drawn across the north wall, its roots stretching across the brick like veins. At its center, a circle of silver paint with a blue sapphire in the middle. No words were written. The symbol said everything. 6 months later, Danielle was invited to speak at a national conference for social equity in San Diego. Her speech was short. "I was told once that power means never having to answer for what you've done. But that's a lie. Power doesn't silence people. Fear does. And we're not afraid anymore." The room erupted in applause. As she left the stage, she passed a group of young girls lining up to meet her. One of them, no older than Kayla, clutched a worn-out newspaper clipping of the Price story. "My mom said you made them remember us," the girl said. Danielle smiled. "No," she said. "We made sure they couldn't forget." That night, as the sun dipped behind the cliffs of Sedona, Danielle, Eliza, Lucas, Luther, and Kayla gathered on the porch of Desert Fix Auto, now repainted and renamed the Monroe Garage and Learning Center. They didn't talk about headlines. They didn't talk about courtrooms. They just sat, passing around lemonade, watching the stars emerge one by one. Kayla looked up and whispered, "Do you think they're watching?" Danielle followed her gaze. Above them, the night sky stretched wide and endless. A canvas too large for any one name to dominate. But somewhere up there, maybe the old stories lived. Maybe the promises made beneath oak trees never really vanished. "I think," Danielle said, wrapping her arm around her daughter, "that truth has a way of shining through. Just like stars. No matter how long the darkness lasts." And beside her, Eliza touched the sapphire ring. Still shining. Still unbroken. Just like them. What this story leaves behind is more than just a reminder. That no matter how powerful the lie, the truth always finds a way back. That promises, though broken, can still ignite revolutions. That even when a name tries to erase you, your voice, your memory, your love, can outlast it all. In a world where wealth can bury the innocent, one woman's courage proved that silence is never permanent and family isn't defined by blood, but by those who refuse to let go. Because sometimes, a ring isn't just a promise. It's a spark. One that burns until the world finally remembers your name.